Yeah.
Is it okay now?
It's a little bit better, yes.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Yeah, let me know if the connection is not good or anything. So yeah, so to keep it brief, a very brief introduction about myself. My name is Qing, and I am based in Amsterdam. I work for a major Chinese media as their Europe correspondent, and I've been covering this outbreak extensively since January. And so it's like fascinating to see how the whole thing like switched entirely from China, spread to the Asia and now in Europe. And so I'm particularly interested in the herd immunity policy that recently released by the British government, but also in general, interested in your perspective of looking at how different countries is dealing with this. Because as I understand, you are now right now you are in Singapore and you are a professor in Singapore as well. So I assume you must have some observation in Singapore and how different countries dealing with this.
Yes, definitely. So yeah, it's I'm in Singapore and I spent a lot of time here in the past. So in fact, I was here during 2003 in the SARS outbreak. So I have some experience of these things.
Oh, cool. So were you in Singapore already before the outbreak, or you just recently went there?
I'm just recently in Singapore as part of a routine visit, I guess.
Okay. So when you were there, Singapore was kind of over with the outbreak?
I've been in Singapore 2 weeks, I guess. So Singapore has been experiencing for a bit longer than that.
Right. Okay, yeah, we'll come back to that later. And I want to start the question from the speech by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson about that things like it seems to we better take a different strategy, which is now this widely discussed policy called herd immunity. And so I wonder, in your opinion, how does this whole policy sound to you? Does it sound unprecedented, or does it sound it's like a routine way of dealing with it when we are dealing with an epidemic?
Well, firstly, I can say that the British government hasn't made it exactly clear, its methodological choices. So we're left to kind of interpret, what they're saying as to what their real policy is. But I'm happy to give an interpretation, and I might be wrong, but I can at least give my perception of that. I would have to say that I think for other governments have been a bit more clearer on their objectives and aims. So the British government's been a little bit opaque in my mind with that. But as I understand it, the idea is not an unusual idea or a concept for epidemiologists, at least. It's this idea of flattening the curve and spreading out your cases so that the hospitals are not overwhelmed in a brief time, so with cases.
Right.
But the background to that must be, the objectives. Why is that the aim of flattening the curve? It seems to me that you're assuming that there is going to be a lot of cases, and what you're trying to do is to make them as manageable as possible. I think if you compare with China, China had a very opposite view. The thought was that this might be perhaps like a SARS outbreak, and it could be controlled, and there's a large effort, to control it and prevent it, and that seems to be largely successful in China. Whereas I think the UK is looking at that as being perhaps daunting or difficult for them to carry out, and then assumed that there will be more cases coming forward.
Yeah, So could you elaborate a little bit more based on what the British government found the Chinese measure will be very difficult? Is it because it's gonna have like huge impact on the economy, the economic shutdown, or is it because of like the people might have a different idea that people won't really follow what the government was saying? So what is the assumption there that the British government, okay, we decide that we can.
So we've got a little bit of delay on that. So I think I understood what you were saying there. I think the strategy from the UK is really that delaying process is because they're worried that long-term carrying out of the containment methods would be too difficult to get compliance from the British population.
Yeah.
And I think if you look now at what's happened in China, China has managed to stop the new cases, transmissions within China, but it is now vulnerable to new people coming in from the rest of the world, might be bringing in their disease into the country. So it's not that China can now relax fully. They still have to be aware that there could be new people coming in who are infectious. And if you imagine that all of these policies have to be put in place actually until we have a therapy or a vaccine or some kind of long-term treatment. So we're not looking at a proposal which is going to be over the next 2 months. We have to think about keeping the population protected until there's a therapy, which might be, people are talking 18 months for a vaccine, and maybe 6 months to a year potentially for a therapy. So we have to put in place some kind of containment, if that's the approach, for that length of time. As far as we know, maybe there'll be a new therapy next month, and everyone would be very happy with that.
Right. So, to your knowledge, like, are there any examples that we know before in the medical history that we had this herd immunity method and it succeeded to other diseases?
So I think the idea of keeping out your most severe cases from occurring in a very short period of time is there are probably other examples. You might think of influenza, for example, as a way of going forward with that. So you don't want all of your cases to happen in 2 or 3 weeks.
Right.
The thought in a uncontrolled outbreak of influenza, for example, that might happen even in large countries like the UK, that could spread through the population perhaps in a month or 2, and everyone would become infected. So the strategy of the government is to try and postpone that. Instead of having it over 1 month or 2 months, is maybe to have it over 6 months or 9 months. And so the number of cases per day would be could cope better with that, rather than having them all in one go. And at the end of that, let's say in 9 months' time, if that policy was carried out, then perhaps 60 or 70% of the population would have been infected, and then protected, probably for life, is our assumption. So at that point, from as the UK heads towards winter next November, December, there would be the population might expect over winter potentially there would be more cases, like influenza occurs every winter in the UK. So at that point, most of the population would be protected by herd immunity, and therefore it would still have small numbers of cases even during the winter year. So I think, as I understand it, the assumption is that we're not going to get a therapy in the next 6-9 months from the British government, and under those circumstances they want to spread out the number of cases over the full year to help the hospitals control it.
I see.
And the difference, I think, is that, for China, at the start, the infection was mostly contained within China. But now WHO has declared a pandemic, and every country in the world appears to be having cases. So I think now that the problem is for China, for example, is that if everywhere in the world has got the disease and they haven't, they're going to be vulnerable to those people potentially visiting or reinfecting China at some point. So the policy in the UK is assuming that that would be impossible for the UK, is to completely control it for 9 months.
Yeah,
or
I see.
whatever therapy came through.
I see. And I read some cases especially in the influenza, that most of the time we still we as a population with immunity through vaccine, effective vaccine to some kind of flus, but like how it still sounds a bit scary, I have to say, to think, okay, such a deadly disease, and the only way that we can get a herd immunity is to get infected like one by one, and sure, like young people are fine maybe, and are probably gonna die very soon. So I wonder the difference of getting the herd immunity between through getting vaccine and through getting naturally infected. What is the difference there in terms of the herd immunity?
Of course, as you pointed out, a vaccine would give you, maybe a very minor or a slight uncomfortable feeling, whereas a natural infection, depends on your age and other factors as to what the outcome might be. So clearly, that's a big difference. If but I'm only trying to interpret the British government's approach here, but this is the way, as I would understand it, is that if they think that controlling the outbreak is impossible, then getting most of the cases during the summer, when the health service is better able to cope with it, would be good. If they delayed it for 6 months or 9 months, and then there was the winter season and all the cases turned up then I think there would be a very difficult situation for the National Health Service.
I see. And also there are, I read from somewhere, there is also a risk that because like now we know about this virus still very little, and so is it safe to assume that, okay, if people get infected, people will naturally get immune? Is that a confirmed fact, or is that something that we're still trying to figure out?
There seems to be more and more evidence that following the infection, people generate a protective immune response.
Right.
So I think that's looking, stronger evidence for that.
Okay.
One thing is that we've been asking for is to look for the immunological testing, which would answer 2 questions. One is a little bit of that answer: are people protected? And I would imagine they're protected. They would be after other coronaviruses, and I imagine it would be for life, which would be good. But it also would tell us about the very asymptomatic cases, those people that have very mild disease and maybe don't even know they were infected. So there's a lot of debate at the moment about what proportion of people, that represents. The British government said that we had, at the time we had 10 deaths. He was describing potentially as many as 10,000 people infected. So if that's the case, then but there wasn't enough testing, and we don't know that number to be accurate or not. But nobody has yet looked at the antibody responses, which is a conventional epidemiological tool to identify the proportion of people infected.
I see. And also, is there a possibility that what if the virus has some mutation, and if the virus started having mutation where this, immunity still work for those who have been infected?
So the virus doesn't appear to be changing very much overall. I mean, every virus changes, and the virus has been through a large number of people, so you'd expect some changes, and I think we're observing some changes. But there's no reason to suspect that it would change so much that it would be immunologically distinct. Not in the short time. It normally takes quite a long time, and there are other human coronaviruses which we get every year, that cause the common cold, and those don't change very much. So I think there's no particular driver to make the virus change. It can clearly infect, and there's a lot of susceptible people at the moment. So I don't see any particular reason why it would change very much at the moment.
I see. And another criticism of the policy of this herd immunity is that this might put those people who are most vulnerable in a very weak position, and especially for those like elderly people. In yeah, what like, is this like a discussion right now, or is it like people think this is like a more conventional approach?
So the British government is trying to prioritize the protection towards the people who might be more vulnerable,
Right.
and is targeting social distancing for those people, and I think that's clearly an important thing. Whether it's enough or not, I think that's a separate question. But I think that's the aim of the policy, is that if you can get your people who might be less affected by the disease, to build up the herd immunity, and then hopefully that will protect the people who are more vulnerable. But as you say, that's a difficult juggling or difficult process to imagine working perfectly.
Yeah, I think the concern that people in general have about the British policy, like even just in comparison to other European countries, not to say China, is that it's taking too little measures to have this social distancing. Like, it doesn't cancel the mass gathering, it doesn't suspend school, and why other European countries are slowly doing this. And do you see a major reason that the British government is doing that? Does it fit your impression of the difference between the British government and the European government?
So as I said, I think they're not making exactly clear why they're taking this approach. I'm just trying to interpret that, and I think the aim would be to imagine that the number of cases would be spread out over the summer. That's what they're aiming for, when the healthcare would be best able to do that. So if you put in protection that worked, extremely well, then maybe that would be delayed. And then possibly you would end up with people being infected during the winter, and that would be more difficult to cope with.
So, right. So can I understand the policy in this way? So the British government wants to flatten the curve, and they want to let's say, be a kind of lazy to control it right now, because if you control it right now, then the peak might come in autumn instead of in the summer. And but the situation is, if the peak comes around the summer, it is the best for the British healthcare system to deal with. And so it's more like a calculation or mathematical question instead of a strategy. Like, I would say, do I understand it correctly?
So I think that's correct. Yes, that's my feeling for that. So it's a strategy of making the most of the healthcare facilities that we have.
Right. But what if what if you can't really control like the number, the number we're gonna have in April, in May, are there solid proof that the government or the healthcare system can control the number?
Well, it's. I think we will wait. We will have to wait. We will have to wait for the evidence, and maybe the policy will change depending on how the numbers look and how that happens. There is some debate also about, whether closing schools, for example, has as much benefit as you would hope it would. The data from flu studies suggests that the children, if they're not at school, they still mix with their friends at home. And I think there's a debate about, if they're not at school, maybe they're with their grandparents offering the childcare. So it's, that might not also be a good thing. So there's some debate about, which strategy would be the best strategy.
Right. And so in an ideal situation, how long would it take for the whole population of Britain to get the herd immunity? Do you have a prediction?
So if I understand the strategy correct, I think they're aiming for herd immunity for the winter season, which I guess is November, December. So they're imagining that up to 60% of the population infected before December.
Okay, but if that's the case, say that we have around 9 months to get the whole population, so the all 47 million people to get infected in 9 months, and that's per day a huge number of people getting infected. And so does that scare people that, okay, today we're gonna have a few tens of thousand or even a few hundred of thousand people that's gonna get infected, and so right now I am gonna give up on all the social distancing because I'm gonna get it anyway. Is that how it works?
So I don't know. So that's the next stage. I mean, if you ask me my strategy might be slightly different, if I was to be thinking about it. I'm in Singapore at the moment, and I think their strategy appears to me, I also don't know exactly the Singapore strategy, but it seems to me that they're hoping that in 6 months' time, maybe there'll be some treatment or therapy, and they're trying to contain until that therapy comes along. So they're in it for the 6 months, or they're trying to prevent an outbreak during that 6 months, so they can keep the numbers as small as possible for as long as possible. So that's a different strategy.
Right. So I think I was under the impression before that the strategy that Singapore was taking is a bit similar to what the British government is trying to do. It's to not to have major lockdown or disruption of the socio-economic life while we're trying to trace people who were infected at the very beginning and treat those most critical cases. And why did it work in Singapore but it didn't work in the UK?
So Singapore is putting a lot of resources into the contact tracing. If you look at the Singapore government's approach, you can see that they able to cluster their cases, and see that from the government website. So they're able to do extensive tracing and extensive testing, and if you're positive, they isolate you very quickly. And I think that's the strategy is to contain and put people who are positive into isolation as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I found that was a bit different in the cases of a lot of European countries, is that they kind of set up the testing standard very high. Like for instance, if you haven't been to an infected area like China or Italy, you won't get a test. And I understand that's the case in the UK, in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, and maybe other countries. So like so in your opinion, do you think it's the case that there was a window that European countries could have controlled it before, but now that the window is kind of closed?
So I'm just to say that I'm very impressed with the Singapore containment
Right.
process. It allows most people fairly confident that the disease is under control. That allows there's no panic buying or panic response in Singapore because there's some confidence in the government that they are doing this, and they're being very transparent in positive cases and doing that clustering, and they have done a good job of identifying positive cases. I think that's impressive. I think in the UK, I would have hoped that we could have done something similar, but it appears that we have not done that. And at some point, the numbers will tip over. The UK is already at the same level that China had when they had a very large response. And so if we were going to take that response, it would be now. Otherwise, I think the door will be slowly closing on that type of approach. If there really was 10,000 cases when the announcement came on the UK strategy, then maybe identifying and isolating all of those 10,000 might already be a bit of a challenge.
Right. Yeah. Because I'm based in Europe, so I kind of saw the numbers slowly like growing high, like from the very beginning, a few imported cases from China, and then later on like a few hundred, but it just take like a few days from a few hundred to 1,000. So do you think there was but yeah, so also for the herd immunity, another question I have is that would it be effective only if most countries in the world would take the same method? Like if it's just like the UK is taking it, it's probably not gonna work because like like people are mobilizing all the time, people are moving all the time.
So you have to imagine where we'll all be in 9 months' time. If in 9 months' time we don't have a cure or a therapy or a vaccine, then you have to imagine that a lot of countries will probably still be having outbreaks, and there'll be still a lot of transmission around the world, as a pandemic. But the UK will probably, if they follow the strategy, will probably be over the worst. We would be, um, most we'd have completed that cycle by then.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So there would we would have had all of the cases in the UK already by that stage, mostly.
Uh, okay, but would that be like a very how do you say um maybe in that case uh put, for instance, like British people in a dangerous position when they are traveling abroad, that people are kind of like, okay, it's Britain is now taking this measure. That means there's a very high chance that every British people coming into our country is probably having the disease.
So the disease is about 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, if you recover quickly, you might be 2 or 3 weeks later, and then you're protected for life. So you could imagine then in 9 months, a British person that's already had the disease could travel anywhere without having to worry about that.
I see. And also, in your opinion, this is probably the last question. In your opinion, like I see a trend that a lot of European countries is doing a quite similar thing. Is that the case in your impression? But they just don't say it.
I think, because this complete strategy is not obvious, and I'm only guessing at that strategy.
Right.
But if you look at, say, Italy response, compare that to the UK response, it would seem that Italy is taking, trying to put more social distancing methods in place, and therefore trying to delay the disease more, or flatten the curve even more potentially. But we will have to see whether that policy actually does flatten the curve any more than the British approach does. I think that's a question we will observe in the next month or so. And whichever strategy is working better, maybe the other country will adopt the other one. I still think that's both everywhere is available for change, and we've got a long haul process to the next 6 or 9 months for us to work out which is the best strategies.
Yeah, I think just a very quick follow up on that. I think from the Italian strategy, let's assume they all have a strategy. From the Italian strategy, you can still go to the British strategy because you will lock down and then you later become more flexible. But is it still possible for the British strategy to go back to the Italian strategy if there is already a lot of population getting infected? Like, can you still lock down the whole city?
Yes, I think it's quite possible to change it in either direction. Yes.
I see. Yeah. Okay. I think. Yeah. That's it. For today. But thank you so much for sharing your insight. I will let you know when the article is out, and if you have any, question or additional comments, let me know, and good luck in Singapore.
Okay. So I guess I won't see an English translation, or.
No, unfortunately, we only publish in Chinese, and
yeah. So I can see from your website. And when do you expect the story to go live?
I think it's gonna be in the coming 1 or 2 days. It's a timely issue,
Okay,
so yeah. So
I'll
I
still
will
be in Singapore, so I can get someone to translate for me.
Oh
Thank you.
yeah, no problem. Yeah, I will send the link to you as long as it's published in the yeah. Thank you so much.
So.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. Good luck. Okay. Bye bye.
All right.
Bye bye.